seconds before the stain, there was lemon cake, warm sunlight, and a quiet backyard where a marriage was about to begin. Music drifted over trimmed hedges. Guests laced their fingers and smiled the way people do when they believe, for a moment, that life has agreed to behave. The bride inhaled. The groom steadied, and a neighbor's shadow stretched across the grass, like a warning. We'll return to that stain. First, how we got here. 3 months earlier, a young man drove past the tallest building carrying his family's name and didn't look up. His name was Marcus Langford, 33, heir to Langford Holdings, a billion-dollar real estate empire that purchased skylines the way other families buy new sofas. He had the polished education, the boardroom diction, the immaculate suit that said he belonged to the floors where carpets never creased. But he also had a private ache, the kind that starts as a question and grows claws. Whose life am I living, mine, or the one selected for me before I took my first breath? Marcus tried to answer that question in conference rooms with sliding doors and framed diplomas, in the shadow of a father who negotiated like a storm, and a mother who could lower a room's temperature by 2 degrees with a single glance. Harold and Miriam Langford loved their son the way institutions love, fiercely, strategically, with plans already printed and bound. They had meetings about his future. They had timelines, draft press releases, a curated list of mentors who wore their mentorship like crowns. When Marcus told them he wanted to step away from the company and build something of his own, the walls themselves seemed to lean in. "You're throwing away the family legacy," Harold said, and the word throwing landed with the weight of steel. He wasn't just a father. He was the man who had turned debt into dominion, a builder who believed the world rewarded velocity. And that hesitation was a leak you patched with pressure. He had raised Marcus to read balance sheets the way other children read bedtime stories. Miriam didn't raise her voice. She rarely needed to. She moved her pearls with 2 fingers, a gesture that said more than language. "If you must date, Marcus." "Why her?" She didn't say Danielle's name. She drew it in the air, her, like a rumor. In Miriam's private dictionary, certain unions created complications. Certain women required explanations she refused to give. Her smile was perfect. The implication underneath it was not. Marcus heard both verdicts. He also heard the sound of his own pulse. Steady. Insistent. Like knuckles on a door he had always ignored. He politely declined the vice presidency they had already monogrammed. He thanked them for the keys to a life he didn't want. Then he walked away from the marble lobby of a kingdom that would never be his by choice. He moved into a modest house in an affluent suburb. The kind of neighborhood curated to look effortless, hedges trimmed as if by an invisible grid, driveways that gleamed, porch lights timed to sigh on at twilight. The community was managed by Whitestone Properties, white envelopes, white letterhead, white gloves on the hand that adjusted what it believed should be adjusted. Marcus carried in boxes labeled with his own handwriting. He loosened his tie and finally breathed. Danielle Bennett met him at the door with coffee and the grin of someone who reads contracts for a living and promises for a hobby. She was 31. principled to the bone. A lawyer who believed language could be a shield if you wrote it correctly and wielded it without apology. She had grown up in apartments where the rules felt like nets and learned early that words mattered when the world tried to twist them against you. She'd put herself through law school with scholarship grit and coffee that could have cleaned engine parts. She'd chosen housing law because she'd watched too many families fold under paperwork designed to look like justice. Danielle had a simple creed. If people are being tripped by the fine print, widen the font. Marcus and Danielle bought that house with money they could count and work they could name. No handouts, no quiet checks, no strings disguised as ribbons. They argued about backsplash tile, laughed over the price of the good lemons, and stood in the living room with tape in their hands deciding where to hang photos that weren't from debutante seasons or ribbon cuttings. If we pay for it ourselves, Danielle said, soft but certain, we stand in it differently. They sealed the promise with a kiss and a trip to the hardware store. And because stories choose their antagonists as precisely as protagonists choose their vows, the neighbor appeared. Her name was Evelyn Shaw, regional property liaison for Whitestone, small shareholder, a woman whose smile looked like it had been ironed flat. She arrived on move-in day with a Tupperware of something beige and a tone that could turn friendliness into policy with a quarter twist. She wore the kind of pastel blouse that makes an argument feel less like confrontation, more like consultation. "Welcome," she said, eyes skipping across their boxes, pausing on their skin. "We're so happy to have diversity." She placed the word like a coaster beneath a sweaty glass, protective and performative. "Standards keep our values up," she added, gesturing vaguely at the manicured yards as if they might crumble without her surveillance. "There are insults that explode. There are insults that evaporate and leave residue." Danielle smiled, accepted the beige something, and carried it inside as if it weighed nothing. Marcus thanked Evelyn and promised to keep the grass trimmed. The door clicked. The couple laughed, the brittle laugh of people who were used to this particular choreography. The veiled compliment, the velvet warning, the eyes that do math you don't ask for. They put the beige dish in the fridge, where it sat and stared at them like a complaint waiting to be filed. If you want to understand Danielle, you need to meet her father. Harold Bennett didn't arrive with speeches. He arrived with a small bag of pastries, a hug that fit his daughter perfectly, and a silence that spoke fluently. He was a respected housing ethics consultant, the kind of man who helps cities fix the rot behind glossy brochures. He trusted systems the way good mechanics trust engines, not naively, but with the daily discipline of maintenance. He believed in audits, in trails you could follow, in clauses that prevented harm instead of punishing it while profits climbed. His face carried the softness of a man who loves deeply, and the lines of a man who has been ignored by rooms where he was the smartest person present. He stepped out of his car in work boots. Habit, not performance. They'd saved him from muddy job sites and wet sidewalks. Evelyn clocked the boots and did an arithmetic so fast it made a sound only she could hear. Back entrance, she said, waving toward the side gate without looking up from her phone. Deliveries go there. She made it efficient, not cruel, like she was instructing a landscaper she'd overbooked. Harold paused, not wounded, cataloging. I'm visiting my daughter, he said, tone steady, eyes level. He didn't offer his resume. He didn't correct more than necessary. He didn't collect apologies. He collected facts. Evelyn glanced up then, smile pressing against her teeth. Of course. That night, Marcus and Danielle ate the pastries and told Harold about the house they would build inside the one they had bought. A kitchen full of people they loved. A shelf of books that didn't judge. A wedding in the backyard under lights they would string themselves. Harold listened like a man reading blueprints, finding the load-bearing walls and the hairline cracks. He didn't warn them. He didn't need to. He stored the day the way he stored everything. Quietly. Precisely. 3 days later, the first citation arrived. White envelope. White stone letterhead. Subject line. Courtesy notice. Lawn height. The grass, it seemed, had grown 1/4 inch above the recommended length. There was a chart. There were consequences that sounded small and were designed to grow. A friendly signature, E. Shaw, Regional Liaison. A smiley embedded in the punctuation. They cut the grass that afternoon. Marcus's lines were architect straight. The mower path turning the lawn into a study in symmetry. He mowed like he was erasing a lie. 2 days after that, another notice. Parking orientation, non-compliant. Marcus had parked 2 inches too close to the curb line. A photo accompanied the notice, cropped close enough to accuse without context. Danielle called the city and confirmed there was no municipal violation. She printed the code that proved it. She slid the paper into a folder labeled House Neutral. Whitestone sent a third letter. Exterior decor, unapproved. The offending item was a rusted wind chime Danielle had inherited from her grandmother. A small thing that sounded like rain when you needed it. The letter called it visual disruption. Danielle read the word twice, then a third time, letting it sit on her tongue like vinegar. Neighbors noticed the envelopes. Some pretended they didn't. A few whispered their sympathies over recycling bins. And one, an elderly black homeowner named Mrs. Ruth Carter, decided whispering was not her ministry. She caught Danielle on her morning run and matched her pace with a shuffle determined enough to be seen. Ruth's sweater was older than most of the cars in the neighborhood, and warmer than any welcome Danielle had received. She told her story without decoration. She made my husband repaint our house 3 times, she said. Found fault in shades of white I've never seen in nature. We moved before winter. Didn't want to use the word, but she didn't want us here. Danielle slowed, then stopped. The wind chime chimed in her head. We're not moving, she said. It wasn't defiance. It was a promise to herself. That afternoon, Danielle drafted responses to each letter using language as a blade, not a bat. She cited bylaws by section and subsection. She attached photographs with dates. She CC'd the city clerk. She concluded with a polite sentence that read like a brick wrapped in velvet. Your enforcement appears inconsistent with Whitestone's written standards and authority. She slid copies into the folder. 36 hours later. 2 notices vanished without comment. The decor violation became a courtesy reminder. Paper, properly aligned, can sometimes push back. You could call this the first micro-win. You would be right. But small wins are often prelude, not finale. A week after that, close to sunset, Evelyn appeared with a tape measure and performed a public ritual. She knelt at the property line and measured grass like a doctor taking a pulse. Expression grave. Body language designed for an audience she believed was always watching. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Measurement is a language of its own. The door camera watched. So did Harold from the porch, a paperback in his lap that he didn't pretend to read. He wasn't angry, he was awake. He knew the choreography, 1,000 cuts disguised as compliance. An accuser who believes their paperwork is armor, and a community trained to see pettiness as protection of values. Danielle laughed that evening, a brittle sound she regretted the moment it left her mouth. She pulled the wind chime down and held it to her chest. Just until the wedding, she murmured, almost to herself. That night, Marcus's phone lit up with a message from his father. Dinner. No arguments, just conversation. It was not a request. Marcus showed Danielle. They weighed the cost of yes against the cost of no. They chose yes. Dinner was at a restaurant whose walls were hung with photographs of men who owned land and the laughter of people who didn't. Harold Langford arrived first, wearing a suit that had learned how to enter rooms on its own. Miriam followed, immaculate, perfume like winter. The tablecloth was white, the forks heavy. The air conditioned to the exact temperature where expensive decisions get made. Harold spoke of legacy, the way preachers speak of salvation. Each sentence structured to sound like rescue, not demand. You don't have to take the company, he said, which meant you should. But you should benefit from what we built. House, wedding, stability. His eyes settled on Danielle, as if she were a line item to be staffed. No strings. Miriam looked past Danielle and spoke to an imagined audience. You can host the wedding at the Langford Hotel, she said. Neutral ground. No complications. There are times when a woman recognizes the shape of a room and decides to rearrange it with a single sentence. Danielle lifted her napkin, placed it gently on the table, and said, "We're making our own ground." She wasn't confrontational. She was finished. After dinner, in the parking lot, Marcus leaned his forehead against the car and laughed softly. Not at his parents, but at the part of himself that had believed peace could be purchased with a menu that didn't list prices. 17 days until the wedding, Danielle said, drawing a circle around the date on the kitchen calendar when they got home. We host it here, in our yard. In the house we paid for. The next morning brought something worse than a citation. The whisper network bloomed. You know the sound. Polite. Practiced. Carefully phrased concern passed from porch to porch. She's strict, but she protects property values, someone said. There's a standard to maintain, another murmured. It's not about race, a third insisted, which is the phrase people use when they know precisely what it is about. And then a voice cut through, arms full of roses and the courage to stand in daylight. Ruth Carter came to their porch carrying a pie that tasted like home and a story she didn't owe them. She invited Danielle inside to see a wall where 2 hooks hung empty. "Neighbors used to be neighbors," she said, tapping the space where photos had been. "Then she came with rules and smile teeth. We moved before the first snow." Ruth didn't cry, not because she hadn't earned the right, because she had cried already, and tears are not renewable energy. Danielle touched the empty hooks and saw the outlines of lives. Celebrations erased by compliance letters. Goodbyes whispered into packing tape. She understood in the small bones of her hands that this wedding would not just be vows. It would be a declaration. Not a fight. A standing. The petty strikes continued, like a dripping faucet designed to torture. Evelyn documented the number of cars parked in front of the house when Danielle's book club met, implying unapproved gathering. She left a note about a string light trial Marcus had strung temporarily, citing visual pollution. The door camera caught her pausing under the eaves and speaking into her phone in a tone that could bruise. "They move in and suddenly every listing looks cheaper," she said, casual, like weather. The microphone recorded it clearly. Words like that don't evaporate. They fossilize. Harold watched the clip once. He didn't curse. He didn't pace. He wrote the timestamp down in neat handwriting and placed the note in the folder labeled House Neutral, which by now carried a second label in smaller print. Not neutral. There was, however, a strange grace in the days that followed. While the neighborhood adjusted its blinds and performed its morality plays, Marcus and Danielle rehearsed a different kind of freedom. They practiced vows while washing dishes. They tested recipes. They learned that love is not the absence of pressure, but the choice to breathe together under it. And every evening, just before the streetlights woke, Harold walked the perimeter of the yard with a gentle eye, the way a father might survey a fence before a storm. He never said, "I am worried." He said, "The ground's good. It will hold." 36 hours before the wedding, a pre-enforcement notice arrived, warning of potential penalties for non-compliant event permitting. It contained just enough official language to intimidate, just enough vagueness to give itself options. Danielle read it, smiled without humor, and replied with the city code attached, highlighted, annotated, and footnoted. She added one sentence that tasted like a gavel. "Your letter asserts authority outside Whitestone's charter." She sent a copy to the city. She copied the HOA board. She printed it for the folder. The reply did not come. Silence sometimes is a threat. Sometimes it's the sound of someone realizing their net has a hole. Night fell. Marcus hung the lights, one bulb at a time, each click a small defiance. Danielle set the table with borrowed china and a lemon cake that could make you forgive people you shouldn't. Harold brought an old speaker and cued music that knew when to lift and when to rest. Ruth Carter, watching from across the street, pressed her hands together and whispered a blessing no one heard but God. The wedding date sat on the calendar like a countdown no one could stop. 17 days. Danielle crossed each one off with a blue pen, a quiet ritual she didn't tell Marcus about. For her, the marks weren't just reminders of a ceremony. They were checkpoints of endurance. 17 days of grace. 17 days without letting Evelyn Shaw win. And for a few brief mornings, the air fooled them into thinking maybe, just maybe, she had moved on. But then came the first escalation. It started with a knock that wasn't a knock, 3 sharp taps that sounded like paperwork arriving on foot. Marcus opened the door and found Evelyn standing there in her pressed khakis and a smile that could slice glass. She held a clipboard like a badge. "Morning," she chirped, too bright for the hour. "Just following up on a compliance concern. Your porch light's intensity exceeds the approved lumens for this district." Marcus blinked. "Lumens?" "Yes," she replied, savoring the syllable. "Excess brightness can affect the visual harmony of the street." He almost laughed. But the truth was, you can't reason with someone who confuses control for purpose. He thanked her, closed the door, and turned the bulb until it dimmed to a gloom that matched her spirit. From then on, she became a constant hum, too quiet to confront directly, too loud to ignore. The citations multiplied. Street view obstruction, parking symmetry deviation, unauthorized assembly risk. Each notice arrived on crisp whitestone letterhead, signed neatly in black ink, E. Shaw, Regional Liaison. Danielle framed them on the fridge, not as trophies, but as evidence. "She's trying to stack the deck," she said. "Let her build it. We'll knock it down together." Marcus admired her calm. But at night, when the lights were off, he heard her breathing deepen with the weight of unspoken fury. That's the thing about dignity. It costs something every time you choose it. A week before the wedding, whispers began to crawl through the cul-de-sac like ivy. "She's difficult," one neighbor said at the community garden. "But she protects property values." "Can you blame her?" another asked. "Things change fast when new people move in." The words hung in the air like smoke. They didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what new people meant. Evelyn, of course, didn't need to speak at all. She'd built herself an orchestra of echoes. That evening, Ruth Carter stopped by. She brought pound cake this time. The real kind with butter that makes forgiveness possible. "Child," she said, settling into a porch chair, "that woman's been doing this for years. I tried fighting her once. Every letter I sent, she sent 2 back. Every meeting I attended, she sat in the front row with a clipboard and a smile that could freeze lava." Danielle poured her tea. "How did you stop her?" Ruth chuckled, slow and tired. "I didn't. I left. But you?" She leaned forward, eyes sharp behind her glasses. "You've got something she's never faced before, a father who knows the system better than she does. Use that." Danielle thought about Harold Bennett, the man who wrote ethics guidelines for people who later broke them. She thought about his calm voice, his unflinching patience, his belief that paper could be mightier than prejudice. And for the first time, she smiled with a different kind of confidence. 9 days before the wedding, Harold returned. He arrived at dawn, in the same boots Evelyn had once mistaken for work shoes. He brought a thermos of coffee and a folder thicker than the Bible. He sat at the kitchen table and spread the citations across it, like evidence at a trial. Every one of these uses the wrong code reference, he murmured. Section 12B doesn't apply to residential decor. It applies to signage. She's bluffing. Danielle watched his fingers trace each line, calm but surgical. He wasn't angry. He was dissecting a lie. Marcus leaned over his shoulder. So, what do we do? Harold smiled faintly. We let her keep writing. He started a new document on his laptop titled Chain of Conduct, Whitestone Region 3. Each citation, each date, each phrase. He didn't plan to argue with Evelyn. He planned to bury her in her own paperwork. Voice steady. Systems choke on paper, he said. Let's give them paper to chew. That evening, the first real crack appeared in Evelyn's mask. She was on her nightly walk, phone pressed to her ear, pacing at the edge of their property. The door camera caught her reflection in the window as she said, low and venomous. They move in, and suddenly every listing looks cheaper. The audio was clear. Too clear. Danielle replayed it twice, her jaw tightening each time. Marcus wanted to confront her, but Harold only shook his head. Not yet, he said. The right silence lasts longer than a loud mistake. He backed up the recording to 3 different drives, labeled each copy with time and date, and tucked one into his jacket pocket like a promise. 3 days later, a new envelope arrived. Pre-enforcement notice. Potential violations of event permitting. It warned of non-compliant gatherings and unauthorized assembly. In plain English, Evelyn was trying to shut down their wedding. Danielle read the letter twice, then pulled up the municipal code on her laptop. She highlighted the relevant passage, attached 2 screenshots, and composed her response in language colder than winter. Your letter asserts authority outside Whitestone's charter and jurisdiction. Further correspondence on this topic may constitute harassment. She copied the city clerk. She copied the HOA board. And, for good measure, she copied herself. Because when you're fighting systems, documentation is armor. Marcus watched her type and thought, this is what courage looks like when it wears glasses and knows the law. Evelyn didn't respond. But the silence that followed had a hum to it, a storm gathering in polite shoes. Then came the countdown. 7 days, Marcus said one morning, marking it off the fridge calendar. They decided to stay busy. Danielle drafted vows. Marcus built the wedding arch with his own hands, oak beams and copper joints, solid enough to survive generations. Harold inspected it like an engineer. It'll hold, he said, and somehow, that sentence meant everything. But trouble doesn't rest. 2 days later, the HOA newsletter arrived with an article clearly written by Evelyn. It talked about the importance of protecting neighborhood character and addressing aesthetic decline. She never used names, but the subtext screamed in italics. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact. The mailman stopped lingering. The world around them bent slightly, the way communities do when fear starts whispering you might be next. Danielle refused to shrink. She hosted her book club anyway, 5 friends, 4 chairs, 1 bottle of wine, and laughter that spilled into the street. Evelyn stood across the road, arms crossed, watching like a warden. At the end of the night, another notice appeared in their mailbox. Unapproved gathering. Potential violation. Danielle laughed so hard she almost cried. She actually wrote potential, she said. She doesn't even know what rules she's breaking anymore. Marcus poured her another glass of wine. Let her build the rope, he said. Dad will tie the knot. 3 days before the wedding, Harold met with an old colleague from the city's housing bureau. Over black coffee in a diner that still smelled like the 80s. The man leaned forward. Whitestone's been on our radar, he said. Too many complaints brushed under the rug. We just need a case that connects their behavior to a pattern. Harold nodded, silent. He didn't need to promise anything. He just needed to finish what was already in motion. That night, he returned to the house with a look that Danielle recognized, a slow burn of certainty. When she makes her next move, he said, I'll be ready. And Evelyn, predictable as a metronome, made it. The day before the wedding, she filed a safety complaint claiming unlawful crowd size. She slipped copies under doors around the neighborhood, inviting residents to observe and report. But the thing about arrogance, it blinds its owner to the ground, shifting beneath them. Danielle's friend at the city clerk's office forwarded her a copy with a note. She's overstepped. This violates Public Code 10.4. She's acting outside her jurisdiction. Danielle smiled and forwarded it to her father. Harold read it once and closed his laptop. Tomorrow, he said softly, she'll hang herself with her own signature. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon, Marcus and Danielle stood in their yard, surrounded by string lights and lemon trees. They didn't talk about Evelyn. They talked about cake flavors, about vows, about how love sometimes has to survive petty wars before it gets to rest. And across the street, behind her pristine curtains, Evelyn Shaw watched them, clipboard in hand, heart full of rot she called righteousness, completely unaware that the clock she thought she was winding for them was ticking for her. Morning stretched soft and golden across the neighborhood, the kind of morning that almost tricks you into believing peace has permanence. Danielle woke before the alarm, her gown hanging near the window like an answered prayer. Outside, Marcus was already adjusting chairs and checking the sound system, his hands steady, his jaw set. This wasn't just a wedding day. It was proof that they had built something beautiful without permission. By 10 a.m., the backyard looked like an oasis, string lights draped across the fence, lemon trees perfuming the air, and tables covered in the kind of details only love and exhaustion can buy. Guests began arriving, friends from college, cousins from out of town, Mrs. Ruth Carter carrying her pound cake and her camera. Harold Bennett stood quietly near the back fence, a suit jacket over his arm, scanning the setup like an inspector of peace. He said little, but his eyes took inventory of every corner, every possible disruption. The music began low, warm, confident. Danielle's heart beat to its rhythm. Across the street, behind a curtain that barely moved, Evelyn Shaw was watching. She'd been watching since dawn. Every chair, every car, every laugh that wasn't hers. She had sent one last email that morning to the Whitestone HOA board, citing an unauthorized event with excessive attendance. No reply. The silence stung like a bruise. So she poured herself a glass of wine and told herself she was defending order. It's what people like her always believe. They're keeping the world neat, even as they dirty it with their fear. Half an hour before the vows, Danielle stood in her gown, framed by sunlight. The music faded and came back as the wind brushed the microphone. Marcus stood near the arch he'd built, his best man fixing his tie, his eyes never leaving her face. The world seemed to hush, waiting for their story to finally arrive at peace. And then 3 sharp knocks at the side gate. Not gentle, not curious, commanding. Every head turned. Evelyn Shaw stepped through like she owned the air. She carried a clipboard in one hand, the stem of her wineglass in the other. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice slicing through the music. "This gathering is in violation of Whitestone regulations. I told you, no public events without approval." The crowd froze. Danielle blinked, once. Marcus took 1 step forward, jaw clenched. He said, evenly, "We've complied with city code. This is private property." Evelyn's smile trembled, half rage, half righteousness. "City code?" she scoffed. "My code is what matters here." Her words hung there, bold and ugly. Then Harold Bennett, calm as sunrise, stepped forward from the back. His voice carried authority without effort. "Ma'am," he said, "you're interrupting a ceremony. You have no standing here." Evelyn turned on him sharply, eyes narrowing. "I wasn't speaking to the help." The words cut through the yard like glass. The officiant gasped. Someone muttered, "Lord have mercy." Even the wind seemed to stop listening. Marcus moved, 1 stride, 2. But Harold's hand rose, steady as stone. He didn't look at Evelyn. He looked at his daughter. "Finish the ceremony," he said quietly. Something in the world shifted. The officiant found her voice. Danielle lifted her chin. Evelyn snapped. She lifted the glass. Red flashed like a warning flare, and she threw it. Wine struck Danielle's gown in a streak of burgundy and disbelief. Gasps broke like thunder across the yard. Marcus surged again, but Harold's hand caught him mid-step. "Finish the ceremony," he repeated, unblinking. Danielle steadied. "Continue," she told the officiant, voice soft but clear. Vows were spoken through shock. Rings slid onto fingers in a silence that felt like defiance. Applause rose, shaky at first, then gathering like weather. Evelyn stood with an empty glass and the sudden knowledge she had lost the room. "Ma'am," someone called from the back. "You should leave." The police, already alerted by a quick-thinking guest, arrived minutes later. They walked her to the street with calm professionalism, one officer murmuring, "Ma'am, please lower your voice." Danielle didn't watch. She stayed still as photographers adjusted angles and guests began to exhale again. Ruth Carter wiped her eyes and whispered to herself, "That's what grace looks like." The celebration continued. Quieter now. More intimate. Marcus and Danielle shared their first dance under the same lights that had survived Evelyn's chaos. The stain on Danielle's gown had begun to dry, faint red lines tracing the fabric like an old wound already healing. Harold stood near the arch, hands folded, face unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his eyes, a calculation, a slow, deliberate resolve forming in silence. He watched the guests laugh again. He watched the police car's taillights fade down the street. And he knew, without a word, that this wasn't over. Because some lessons don't end with a wedding. Some need a reckoning. That night, long after the music faded and the dishes were cleared, Harold sat in the quiet living room while the newlyweds danced barefoot in the kitchen. He watched them, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then he opened his briefcase and slid out a folder labeled Whitestone Properties. Inside were copies of every citation Evelyn had ever issued. Dates, addresses, complaint numbers, all neatly organized, all traceable. He took out a pen, circled her name, and made a single note in the margin. Pattern established. Then he leaned back, folded his hands, and exhaled. The kind of exhale that means something has begun. Outside, the neighborhood was silent. Inside, justice was starting to breathe. Night had settled over the city like a verdict waiting to be read. The wedding was over, but the echo of it lingered, half laughter, half disbelief. Danielle and Marcus slept light, curled in the silence of a house that felt both holy and wounded. In the next room, Harold Bennett sat by the window with a lamp on low, files open, and the door just slightly ajar. He hadn't said a word since the police left, but his mind was alive, cataloging, connecting, constructing. Because that's what he did best, build quiet systems of consequence. Evelyn Shaw, meanwhile, sat in a holding cell at the Whitestone Police Precinct, her mascara streaked and her entitlement collapsing under fluorescent light. She tried to charm the desk officer, but charm rarely survives paperwork. "I told you," she repeated. "It was an accident. I slipped. The glass just—" The officer didn't look up from his clipboard. "You threw wine at a bride during her wedding ceremony. We have video from 3 angles." "It's being exaggerated," Evelyn snapped. "People love a story when there's color involved." He gave her a look, flat, unimpressed, exhausted. "You're free to call someone. Phone's there." She turned her back to the camera, picked up the receiver, and began scrolling through names in her head. Her husband had left years ago. Her sister wouldn't answer. So she dialed the one number she thought would still take her call, David Keller, CEO of Whitestone Properties. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Evelyn, it's late." "What?" "There's been a misunderstanding," she interrupted, already defensive. "Something happened at one of the houses in my district. It's a PR thing. I just need the company's lawyer." David sighed, long and low. "What did you do?" "It's nothing, just some overreaction at a private event. People took things out of context." There was a pause, the kind that felt like a step backward. "Evelyn," he said finally, "I saw the video." She froze. "What video?" "The one all over social media," Keller said. "You'll see it soon enough." He hung up. The next morning, the video had traveled faster than rumor. Every feed, every comment section. Neighbor throws wine on black bride during wedding. Guest's father may press charges. It was 10 seconds of footage that told 1,000 years of history. And at its center, Evelyn's face, contorted with fury, frozen mid-throw. Harold watched it over coffee, expression unreadable. He didn't enjoy it. Justice to him was never entertainment. It was correction. He forwarded the link to 3 people: a friend at the housing bureau, a contact in municipal ethics, and an attorney he'd trained years ago. Then he opened the file labeled Whitestone Pattern. Inside were 8 separate complaint letters from families across the county, all signed by E. Shaw. Different handwriting, same voice, violations of decorum, unapproved color scheme, non-compliant event use. A quiet campaign of exclusion hidden under bureaucratic politeness. Harold leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This isn't about one woman," he murmured. "It's about what she's allowed to represent." He picked up the phone and dialed his old friend at the housing bureau. "Sam," he said, "how fast can you pull Whitestone's compliance roster?" By noon, the roster was in his inbox. Every regional liaison, every listed property, every citation. Evelyn's name appeared 76 times in one fiscal year, 3 times the next highest number. She'd built her own paper empire out of prejudice and procedure. That afternoon, David Keller, the CEO, called Harold directly. "Mr. Bennett," he began, voice tight with panic. "I wanted to reach out before this story spins further. We're aware of the situation." Harold's tone was even, surgical. "Good. Then you're also aware that this isn't an isolated case." Keller hesitated. "We're conducting an internal review." "I'm sure you are," Harold said, "but you'll find your internal review lacks credibility if the Bureau decides to open theirs. And if that happens, well, let's just say every client on your investor list will see a pattern." "Are you threatening me?" "No," Harold replied calmly. "I'm giving you a choice." There was a silence, then the sound of surrender, the exhale of a man calculating loss. "What do you want?" Keller asked. "Accountability," Harold said simply. "Terminate her contract, make a statement, a real one, admit the pattern, correct it, and compensate the families you harmed. Then maybe, just maybe, I'll help you clean up the rest." Another pause. Then, "You'll have it by morning." When the call ended, Harold looked down at the folder and smiled faintly. Not out of satisfaction, but because he knew how rare it was for power to yield without blood. By the end of the day, Whitestone's website carried a press release. Effective immediately, Evelyn Shaw is no longer affiliated with Whitestone Properties. The company has initiated a review of compliance practices to ensure fairness and equality across all communities. Corporate language, sterile and cautious, but underneath it, the tremor of fear. Within hours, Evelyn's key card stopped working. Her shares, small but symbolic, were forcibly repurchased under the reputational harm clause. She lost her income, her title, her identity in the same breath. At home, she threw open drawers and slammed cabinets, searching for someone to blame. The mirror offered only her own reflection, tired, angry, cornered. She whispered to herself, "They set me up. That family set me up." But the truth was simpler. She'd set herself on fire, and the world had finally stopped offering water. That evening, Danielle found Harold sitting on the porch, his suit jacket draped over the railing, the air thick with cicadas. "I saw the statement," she said quietly. Harold nodded, still watching the street. "I didn't mean for this to go that far," she added. "I just wanted to be married." He smiled, the kind that hurts a little. "You wanted peace. Sometimes peace has to be built over rubble." She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. You didn't have to do all that. I didn't, he said, but people like her stop only when the right person tells them to. The porch light hummed above them, steady and low. Across the street, Evelyn's house was dark, empty windows, for sale sign leaning forward in the grass. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just rearranges the neighborhood quietly. The next morning, Harold received another call, this time from a reporter. Mr. Bennett, sources say you advised Whitestone on this. Would you comment? Harold thought about it for a long moment, then said, No comment. Let the system speak for itself. But the system didn't just speak, it shifted. Within a week, 2 more liaisons resigned. A third was suspended. Whitestone introduced new guidelines written in Harold's language. Compliance must serve communities, not control them. The story became a case study at the Housing Bureau, a quiet revolution born from one act of humiliation turned into reform. Evelyn tried to fight back. She sent letters, hired a lawyer, filed a complaint of wrongful termination. But no one wanted her case. She walked into offices that once stood when she entered and found chairs that suddenly stayed seated. Her name had become shorthand for what happens when arrogance meets evidence. Desperate, she drove to the city, to an office she remembered well, the Langford Tower, home to Marcus's parents. She thought they would understand. After all, she'd brokered deals for them once. She walked into the marble lobby, head high, and demanded to see Harold and Miriam Langford. The receptionist called upstairs. A moment later, a guard escorted her to the executive floor. Miriam Langford met her in a conference room lined with family photos. Evelyn began talking fast. This is all a misunderstanding. That woman, she turned everyone against me. Some black bride and her meddling father. Miriam's hand moved, calm and deliberate, toward a silver-framed photo on the table. She turned it so Evelyn could see. A small backyard. String lights. A young black couple smiling beneath them, Marcus and Danielle. That black bride, Miriam said, voice soft but merciless, is my daughter-in-law. Evelyn froze, the words slicing through her like winter air. No, that's impossible, she stammered. Marcus Langford? He lives next door to... She stopped. Memory flooded her face. The moving truck. The laughter. The day she filed the first citation. I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know who they were. Miriam tilted her head slightly. So, if you had known, she asked, would that have changed what you did? Evelyn's lips parted, but nothing came. She was searching for a version of herself that didn't exist, one that could still be forgiven. You don't understand, she pleaded. I was protecting the neighborhood. I didn't mean harm. You meant control, Miriam interrupted. You meant power, and you threw it, just like that wine, because you thought no one important would care who got stained. Evelyn shook her head, trembling now. I made a mistake. No, Harold said finally, his voice low as a gavel. You made a choice. The room went silent. Even the air seemed to draw back from her. Miriam's expression softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. You've been given every courtesy this system offers people like you. That ends today. Evelyn took a step forward. Please, Miriam, Harold, I can fix this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. But security was already at the door. Miriam's final words landed like closure. Not cruelty. You humiliated my family. We can't help you. Security escorted Evelyn out. Her heels echoed down the marble like punctuation marks on the end of her story. By evening, Whitestone's investors had voted to remove her name from all regional filings. Her career was not suspended, it was erased. And on that same evening, in a small house across town, Harold Bennett closed his final file. He placed it in a box labeled Resolved and set it beside the wedding photo Ruth Carter had sent over, a gift framed in gold. He poured himself a drink, looked out the window at the quiet street, and whispered, "That'll do." The world outside looked unchanged, but beneath its surface, something permanent had shifted. Injustice had been documented. Consequence had been delivered. And somewhere, in the silence between one life ending and another beginning, a new standard had been set. The city moved differently when Evelyn Shaw fell silent. Her name, once whispered as a threat in HOA meetings, had become shorthand for caution. People said it the way they said lawsuit or recession. The sound of it made boardrooms pause. Evelyn caught her reflection, her face tight, her eyes wide, and finally saw what everyone else had already seen. A woman undone by her own entitlement. Across the suburb, life moved on without her. A moving truck backed into her driveway a few days later. Cardboard boxes stacked on the curb, labels smeared by sweat. No neighbors came to say goodbye. Curtains stayed closed. Only Ruth Carter, watering her roses, looked up long enough to whisper, "God don't sleep." Evelyn climbed into her car, the passenger seat filled with folders and uncached pride. The tires rolled slowly over the asphalt she once believed she owned. 3 weeks later, Whitestone Properties quietly published an update to its ethics manual. Buried in legal language was a single new clause. Compliance cannot be weaponized. It was Harold Bennett's sentence, lifted directly from the notes he'd sent to Keller during the cleanup. The board didn't credit him, of course. Men like Harold rarely need credit. Their victories live in the systems they leave behind. Housing bureaus across 3 counties adopted the policy within months. Evelyn Shaw's name appeared in internal memos, not as a villain, but as a case study. A cautionary tale in how racism hides behind regulation until someone with a steady hand drags it into daylight. That evening, the world outside was quiet again. The stain on Danielle's gown had faded to a whisper of color, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. She and Marcus sat on their porch steps, barefoot, sharing the last slice of lemon cake they'd saved from the wedding. The air was thick with summer and relief. Harold stood beside his car, suitcase in hand, eyes soft. He'd done what needed to be done. Danielle looked up. "You didn't have to go through all that trouble, Dad." "I didn't," he said, "but people like her stop only when the right person tells them to." Marcus reached out, shook his father-in-law's hand. "Thank you for standing up when we couldn't." Harold smiled faintly. "You stood just fine. I only made sure the ground beneath you held." He hugged them both, the kind of embrace that speaks in quiet completion. Then he turned toward his car, the weight of peace, heavy but earned. Across the street, movers cleared the last of Evelyn's house. The for sale sign tilted slightly forward in the grass like a bow to the inevitable. Ruth Carter waved from her porch, watering can in hand. Neighbors began to emerge, first cautious, then friendly, bringing small offerings. A plant, a card, a nervous joke about HOA meetings. The street exhaled. A community healed itself, not through noise, but through accountability. As twilight deepened, Harold drove away and Danielle watched the taillights fade. Voiceover. Some people learn when they lose power. Others only stop when they have none left. The porch light flickered on. The air smelled of lemon cake and forgiveness. And for the first time since they'd moved in, the neighborhood finally felt like home.